Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to talk tonight about Donald Trump, the former and potentially future president in the United States, and particularly some of his legal challenges that are front page news seemingly every day. And Douglas Elliott, who I've had the privilege of interviewing before, he is a civil litigator. He's a constitutional law expert. He's a partner at Cambridge LLP, and he's a really nice, smart guy. Wrote a really interesting, very detailed analysis of this most recent New York decision against Donald Trump recently. And so I wanted to reach out to him so we could analyze it and understand it in a little bit greater detail than I think we do when we just watch CNN for a couple of minutes every evening, which I tend to do way too much of. So Douglas Elliott, sir, welcome to the show.
Nice to be back, Brian. Thanks for having me.
So we were just chatting about this decision in the United States, and you were updating me that on Thursday of last week, Donald Trump tried to delay the implementation of the economic penalties, and you're saying that the judge has found that no, he's got just, I think it's a month that he's got to come up with the cash, and he's got to put it up in cash or a bond if he wants to appeal it. And I think I also heard the Attorney General of New York say that that if he didn't, she was going to trigger sales of assets. So tell me where you think Donald Trump is right now, and this is obviously compounded not only by I can't remember, was it 340 or 440 or something like that million, and then you add an interest, it's up into the 400 million kind of range of amount of money that he's got to pledge. Plus he's got the, what is it, 5 plus 80, 85 in total for the Eugene Carroll case. Plus he's got something going on in Georgia and Florida and Washington. Where do you see all of this right now, sir?
Well, Donald Trump is in a heap of trouble, and he always likes to pretend like he isn't. And he's certainly been in financial trouble before, but never anything like this. He is in a huge cash crunch that is going to impact on him, impact on his business, and impact on his ability to run for president of the United States, because it's very expensive to run for office in the United States. You need hundreds of millions of dollars to run for president. And right now, Donald Trump's legal problems are consuming not only every penny that he has, but every penny that his supporters could pledge towards getting him to be president. So the problems just have been escalating in an exponential way over the last couple of years. He's got more cases going to trial this year than any human being in the United States. Very serious criminal charges in several jurisdictions, plus these civil cases. And the civil cases are really bad news for him. He's a rich guy. There's no doubt about it. Even though he lies about how much he's worth, even the Attorney General of New York agreed that he's probably worth about $2 billion. The problem is that's not all cash. And right now he needs a lot of cash. In order to appeal these two, you mentioned these two rulings, Brian. So there's two rulings that he wants to appeal. And under the New York law, in order to appeal those decisions, he has to either fork over the cash to the court to be held while he appeals, or he has to find someone who's willing to give him a bond for that amount of money that can be posted with the court. And it ain't easy to get a bond of that size, let me tell you, especially given his track record. So the Carroll case, he had put up the $5.5 million that he needed to appeal the original judgment. Then he got socked with the second judgment because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. And now, in order to appeal the second judgment, he's got to come up with about $90 million. Okay, so now having forked over 5, he's got to come up with another 90. According to all accounts, Donald Trump had been trying to build up his cash, and he had built up perhaps $300 or $400 million in cash. I don't think even he expected that he was going to have to put up all of that cash and more. But that's where he finds himself, because in addition to the 95 million for the Carroll case, as a result of Thursday's ruling, if he wants to appeal Justice Engoron's ruling, and he surely needs to, he's got to come up with about $455 million. So that's a total of $555 million in cash. And the problem is that twofold. First, he doesn't have $555 million in cash. He might have perhaps $300 or $400 million. And that will take up every available piece of cash he's got. The second problem he's got is another aspect of the court order, two aspects of the court order that's going to make it difficult for him to raise that money. Number one, he's not allowed to borrow money from any bank that does business in New York. Well, that's just about every bank in the world that does business in New York, with the exception of Russian banks. That's a little scary. The second thing is that he's not allowed to take a nickel out of his business without the prior approval of a monitor that's been put into the company by Justice Engoron, a retired judge named Judge Jones. So he can't take 5 cents out of the Trump organization without going on bended knee to Judge Jones and asking for her permission. It's humiliating for him, and it's going to cause him huge financial problems. And so right now, he's soaking up every penny he can get from his PACs, from his political action committee, from his company, from his personal wealth. And now we've had Lara Trump, his daughter-in-law, saying that, well, maybe the Republican National Committee should be reaching into their jeans and paying more for his legal fees. They're already paying about $1 million a year for his lawyers. They've only got about 10 million in the kitty. I think the burn rate for his lawyers right now is probably about $10 million a month. I don't know.
$10 million a month in legal fees?
Yeah. Last year, his legal fees doubled from 25 million the year before to 50 million. Those are just the ones we know about, because they were being paid by his PAC. But they went up from the first 6 months of the year to the last 6 months of the year. They went up by 30%. They went up the first part of the year. He was spending at a rate that accelerated by 30% in the second half of the year. He spent more money on legal fees than he collected from donors last year for the first time.
I'm not familiar with U.S. election laws, but what you're saying is that you can donate to someone's political action committee, thinking that your donation was for the benefit of them running a campaign for president, and they can use that money for their own personal legal expenses? Seriously?
I know it's crazy. You would never be allowed to do it in Canada. It would be completely illegal, and no political party would ever let you do it. But there's two things. First of all, they have these things called political action committees in the United States that are very loosely regulated. And all the reports I've heard about it is there's virtually zero chance of any successful prosecution for violating election finance laws when it's a PAC. When it comes to the actual Republican National Committee funds, apparently the laws are a little tighter, but even then, it's a free-for-all in the U.S. Ever since a U.S. Supreme Court decision a number of years ago called Citizens United, the Supreme Court basically said, well, freedom of expression and freedom of politics and blah, blah, blah. And they struck down restrictions on election financing. So nowadays, everyone, I think, in the United States thinks you can do whatever you want with money you raise for politics.
Well, let's turn to the different cases, if we could, and really focus in on this one with Justice Engoron. Is that the correct pronunciation of this case in New York? Because the number one, the amount is astounding. I understand that the law is a law specific to New York State, and it's different in New York State than it may be elsewhere. And there's been a lot of criticism of it and the size of the penalty. You produced quite a detailed and excellent review of it. So let's take a break for some message and come back in 2 minutes and have Douglas Elliott walk us through the details of this 92-page finding that the judge produced, which I think what you said, Douglas, is it's a very well-written and detailed reasoning that the judge prepared, probably because he wanted to make sure that the chance of appeal was low.
Yeah. Oh, he knows that Donald Trump is going to appeal his ruling. So when judges know that, they write very carefully if they're capable of writing carefully. And this judge has written very carefully indeed.
Back in 2 minutes with Douglas Elliott talking about Donald Trump and his legal challenges. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is Donald Trump and his legal problems. We're going to go through a couple of the different cases, but particularly this one in New York State, New York City, that was found that he owed something over $300 million with interest over $400 million for fraud. And the fraud was primarily in regards to him inflating the asset values of himself and the Trump organization. And my guest is Douglas Elliott. He's a lawyer. He's a partner at Cambridge LLP. He's a civil litigator. He's a constitutional law expert, and he's a really smart and very nice guy. We've had the chance in the past to talk about some big issues that he's taken to the Supreme Court, some civil litigation issues, some human rights issues, and this man knows what he's talking about. And he's produced quite a long and detailed review of Judge Engoron's 92-page reasoning on the case. So, Douglas, walk us through it, if you could.
Okay. So the first thing people need to understand, because I think a lot of Canadians look at this, and first of all, the reports are misleading. They see references to fines or penalties, and they think he's been facing criminal fraud charges, and a $450 million fine for criminal fraud seems totally disproportionate. And it would be, I think, in the United States and in Canada. But it's not a fine, and it's not a criminal charge. So people need to get that out of their minds. The first thing, what Canadians need to think of when they look at this case is proceeds of crime. We all know that if you're a drug dealer in Canada, the police can swoop in, they can seize your cash, they can seize your house, they can seize your Ferrari as proceeds of crime. It's not about a fine. It's about taking away the fruits of your illegal activity. And that's what this case is about at bottom, is the fact that the Trump organization is a criminal organization that has been operating frauds for decades. The judge said the CFO, Alan Weisselberg, has been engaged in hundreds of fraudulent business records, hundreds. It is the biggest case of fraud. The judge said he's not Bernie Madoff, but that's who you have to think of. If you're trying to think of someone who's a bigger crook than Donald Trump, that's the only one who's more crooked than Donald Trump is Bernie Madoff.
But on numerous occasions, people have talked about this being a victimless crime. So if there's not a victim, how do they come up with $345 million of ill-gotten proceeds?
There's absolutely victims. Let's not forget that his bank, Deutsche Bank, fired him once they found out about this fraud. His accountants fired him once they found out that he had lied to them and implicated them in producing fraudulent financial statements. You know, anybody who works in the business world, Brian, knows that accurate financial statements are always required in connection with loan transactions. Heck, the average Canadian knows you can't lie to the bank. When you go get a mortgage, you can't lie about how much money you make. You can't lie about how much your house is worth. That's not a victimless crime if the bank gives you a mortgage for 5% when you really shouldn't have got a mortgage at all, or you should have got a mortgage at 12% instead of 5%. So the basis of the crime in this case is twofold, and the victims. Number one, he was able to get loans at a lower rate of interest, there was very clear evidence that he would have been charged. He was still probably would have got the loans if he told the truth, or he might have. But if he did tell the truth, then he would have paid 4 percentage points more on his loans than he actually did. So Deutsche Bank didn't get to collect the interest that they should have received if he'd paid the correct rate of interest. Not all borrowers are created equal. And the judge calculated that the interest savings, there were a few other lenders besides Deutsche Bank, the interest savings amounted to around $160 million. That gave put money right into Donald Trump's pocket, and it also created capital that he could then use he outbid other people for certain transactions. And that brings me to the other big item in this judgment, which is the old post office, which people may remember there was some scandals associated with the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. Well, it turns out that Trump won the competition to get that property by filing false financial statements. So all of the competitors who had legitimate financial statements and never got to buy that property got ripped off by Donald Trump. Donald Trump also managed to finance that property by getting loans at artificially low rates of interest because he lied about his net worth. The judge looked at that whole transaction because Trump ended up selling his hotel. This was one of his schemes to generate cash to preserve himself for the future, have money for his criminal lawyers this year. And the judge said, this whole transaction from beginning to end is a fraud. And he ordered Trump, the Trump organization, and the Trump boys, Eric and Donald, to disgorge every penny that they made out of the sale of the Trump Hotel in Washington, about $180 million. That, I'm sure, has come as a big shock to Trump, because I think he was counting on that money to be able to pay his criminal lawyers this year. And now that money is going to be going to the state of New York.
Unbelievable. And you said that this is based on a unique law, a unique New York law. Can you tell us about this law?
Yes. So this law isn't a new law. This law Trump is only the latest target of this law. Some people may remember Pharma Bro. Do you remember Pharma Bro, who artificially inflated Martin Shkreli? He artificially inflated drug prices. He was a scoundrel. He got hit with this law. This law goes back to the 1950s. It was brought in under lobbying by the Better Business Bureau of New York because they said the existing fraud laws were not protecting consumers because it was hard to prove fraud in a criminal court, and little people were unlikely to sue for fraud, and then it's difficult to collect. And so they wanted the government to create a law that would make it illegal for anyone. It's all about licensing. You can't do business in the state of New York unless you have a license from the state of New York. That's a privilege. It's not a right. So if you are engaging in repeated fraudulent or dishonest practices, the Attorney General of New York can go after you, and they can get a wide range of remedies against you. They can get an injunction. They can force you to pay damages. They can put in a receiver. They can take away your license, which this judge had threatened to do at one point, to just take away their licenses altogether.
He suspended it for 3 years or something.
He suspended them, not the businesses.
Oh, okay.
The businesses, because he said, if I shut down the businesses, that's going to hurt other innocent people who work for those businesses. It's going to cause the economic disruption. But Trump himself and his two offspring are not allowed to work in New York for the next 2 years in the case of the sons, and 3 years in the case of Donald Trump, because they are crooks. That's the reason. And now their company will be run by this judge, Judge Jones, and also will have an enforcement officer for the first time. Basically, it's shocking, really, this big company, ever since Weisselberg left, it hasn't had a CFO. It's never had a compliance officer. There's no one making sure that this company is run on an honest basis, or that the financial information it generates is honest and in accordance with what we call generally accepted accounting principles. It is incredible for anybody who's used to dealing with commercial cases and how normal businesses operate. This looks a lot more like Al Capone and Bernie Madoff than it does like any legitimate real estate organization.
But to get those kinds of loans from any bank, Deutsche Bank obviously included, one would have thought you'd had to not only provide financial statements internally produced, but you'd have to get audited financial statements. You'd have to get appraisals done by third parties, and how can you commit that fraud, not only yourself, but with all these other people agreeing to it effectively?
Well, not everyone did agree to it. So the victims were also the accountants and the appraisers, because what was happening is Weisselberg would get an appraisal from John Smith that this building is worth $50 million. And then he would go to the accountants and he'd say, I have an appraisal from John Smith, and he says that the building is worth $150 million. And John Smith would have no idea that the Trump organization just blatantly lied about the opinion that he had given. Then the accountants would then tell the Deutsche Bank, well, we are told by management that the building is worth $150 million based on an appraisal from John Smith. But the accountants never actually saw the appraisal. They were just told what the appraisal said by Weisselberg. So Weisselberg and three other guys, including the famous Michael Cohen. People may remember Michael Cohen. He used to be Donald Trump's personal lawyer and fixer. So this gang of four used to get together. They take the information they had and then they'd manipulate it, and they just blatantly lie. Like they lied about the size of Trump's condo. They said it was 30,000 square feet instead of 10,000 square feet. 40 Wall Street, they said instead of it losing $3 million a year, they said it produced a profit of $30 million a year. They said Mar-a-Lago was worth $1 billion when it was only worth about $300 million. Like they said that one of his properties in Scotland, you were allowed to build 500 units at about 30,000 pounds a piece. They said, oh no, we can build 2,000 units at 110,000 pounds a piece. I mean, they just blatantly lied, not by a small amount, not like 5%, 10%. They lied by a factor of 200%, 400% about values. And the problem is that the Deutsche Bank or other lenders would believe the accountants, and the accountants believed management because management was telling them that all of these values came from legitimate appraisals. And the legitimate appraisals were done, but the legitimate appraisals had different numbers than were being reported to the accountants.
And you're saying, and the judge was saying that Deutsche Bank never went back to the accountants demanding the actual appraisals, and the accountants never went back to management demanding the actual appraisals, and so therefore no one actually checked the accuracy of these statements that went to Deutsche Bank?
That's correct, because there are different levels of a financial statement in the New York system. And this is the lowest level of accuracy. It's called Statement of Financial Condition, or compilation. So in a compilation under New York law, the accountants are not required to check anything. They're entitled to believe what management tells them. Now, Deutsche Bank knew that. So Deutsche Bank was stupid, in my opinion, stupid and greedy, but they thought they were dealing with a really rich guy. And they weren't the only ones.
And an honest guy.
And an honest guy. The state of New York made the same mistake, and several other lenders, when they saw this big accounting firm. You think about it, it's called Mazars. It's not so well known here. But imagine if you get a financial statement from somebody like KPMG or Deloitte, and it says that the guy has appraisals and he's worth $8 billion. you're going to assume that KPMG and Deloitte know what they're talking about, and you're going to believe them. And unfortunately, in this case, Deutsche Bank, like if I was a Deutsche Bank shareholder, I'm going to tell you, I'd be thinking about a class action against Deutsche Bank.
So, I apologize, but I raise money on a fairly regular basis. And the banks ask for, number one, financial statements. Number two, for appraisals. Number three, they review those appraisals and ask questions. Often they want a reliance letter directly from the appraiser to them, so that it's something that is directed to them, not to management of the company. They ask for environmental reports. They ask for building conditions reports. They go visit the facility. They check everything, and appropriately so.
Yeah, not this time. No, Deutsche Bank said we're entitled to rely on what Donald Trump says. And there was a very careful consideration of the evidence. In this case, there was lots of evidence put forward. If you're in the business of raising money sometimes, Brian, you'll find this one laughable. The expert for Donald Trump said it didn't matter that he misled the Deutsche Bank because they didn't care about the financing conditions. They didn't care about the covenants. All they cared about was getting paid, and they got paid. The judge did not buy that. And obviously neither did Deutsche Bank, because they won't do business with Donald Trump now.
So I saw Kevin O'Leary of Shark Tank, et cetera, on CNN this past week. And he said that he's talking to lots of business people that aren't going to do business in New York anymore because they're scared to death of this law. Because he says, everyone, does the same. All businesses do the same sort of thing. And this was politically motivated against Trump, and it's a bad law, and it's going to scare people off from doing business in New York. What do you say to that, sir?
Well, I think Kevin O'Leary is entitled to his opinion, but he's dead wrong. This law was brought in the 50s by a Democratic administration. It was immediately after that Democratic Harriman administration was the Rockefeller Republican administration. There have been several Republican administrations in Albany since then. Every time they've come into power, they either leave that law alone or they make it tougher. So, and it's been used against a whole bunch of people before Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as the judge said, Donald Trump always blames somebody as being on a mission against him once he doesn't get his own way. He's like a 3-year-old child. He agreed, for example, to Judge Jones being appointed as the monitor. Then after she caught him with his hand in the cookie jar, she said she must be on some political witch hunt and she's being unfair to him. This prosecution, of course, it was politically motivated in the sense that the Attorney General of New York said that she was tired of Donald Trump getting away with fraud for years. As the judge said, this isn't his first rodeo. They already shut down Trump University for fraud. They already shut down the Trump Foundation for fraud. They've already been convicted of tax fraud for giving benefits to Weisselberg and others and not treating them properly under the tax laws. So they have a repeated history of fraud, but no one's ever used the atomic bomb, which is this law, the section 5312, I think it's called, of the Commercial Code of New York. They've never used the atomic bomb against the Trump organization, and he's gotten away with this crooked business practice for years because he's been like too big a target. And I applaud the Attorney General of New York for taking the position that no one is above the law and that everyone has to produce honest business data. Honest business people have nothing to fear from this law. This, as the judge says, like appraisals, he said, appraisals, there's an art and a science. And I accept that maybe there could be a range, maybe it could be 10%, it might even be up to 50% that people could disagree. But you can't be, the science part of an appraisal, you can't be fraudulent about that. You can't say that something has 30,000 square feet when it's only got 10,000 square feet.
This is one of the things that I found so astounding about this, and particularly about, frankly, Kevin O'Leary's comments this past week, because I don't think business people on average are dishonest. I think that all of them, except a few, are very honest. And I do appraisals all the time, and they are different. There's no question. I've got a couple of appraisals right now that are 10, 12% different, but they're only 10 or 12% different between an appraisal that, the vendor got or the purchaser got. So there are some differences. And my sense is that people go through those appraisals with a fine-tooth comb. And I've had appraisals where people have criticized the determination of acreage and have asked for surveyors to go out and check the acreage, questions about square feet. In fact, in one appraisal recently, someone said, you counted the rooms wrong. There's one less room than you said, and there's not a wet bar. There's actually just a dry bar. And so people go through appraisals with a fine-tooth comb. I don't think I've ever seen something where you could multiply the number of square feet by 3, or the take away the zoning rule that says it can't be used as residential and change the zoning rule to say that you could deem it as residential land. Like, that's just not
or the rent control law, and say that, well, I could rent these out for market rents, even though there's a rent control law that says you can't. I can turn this into a private residence, even though there's a zoning law that says I can't. I can build 2,000 units on this land, even though the law only allows 500. And the problem in this case, I mean, as I say, Deutsche Bank was stupid and the other lenders were stupid because they took the accountant's word for it. The accountants were stupid because they took Weisselberg's word for it. But it's very clear when you read this, like, this was the weirdest organization I've ever seen. Like, if you wanted to see the financial statements, you couldn't, they wouldn't give you a copy of them, Brian. You had to walk into Trump Tower under guard, read the financial statements, and then leave without taking a copy of them. I've never seen that in my life. That you always have to give a copy of the financial statement to the lender, always. And they do go over it with a fine-tooth comb. But in this case, I think because Donald Trump created this illusion that he was worth billions, that the lenders got greedy and stupid and started waiving all of the normal precautions that a normal lender would do. And in fact, this was Donald Trump's defense. He said, I told these people you can't rely on these financial statements. And if they relied on them, more fool they. That's their problem, not my problem.
Isn't that a good defense?
No.
Why?
Not under the New York law, because the New York law says you're not allowed to produce a false, fraudulent financial statement. That the wrong under this law is created the moment you cook the books. If you cook the books and you produce a fake financial statement, you've broken the New York law. It doesn't matter if anyone relies on it. If they can prove that you cooked the books and your intention was to deceive someone with those fraudulent books, you have violated the law. And the only question is, what is the appropriate penalty? And Justice Engoron determined the appropriate penalty was $450 million, an order that he's not allowed to borrow from New York banks, and an order that Donald Trump can't do business for the next 3 years in the state of New York, and that the whole Trump organization has to be put under the management of 2 officials who are appointed by the court and will have to approve every nickel that is spent over the next 3 years.
We're going to take a break and come back after the messages and ask about pages 7 through 60, which is, as you said, a really careful analysis of the evidence given by each witness. I was amazed that the judge went through a credibility assessment on every single witness. Stay with us, everyone. Back with Douglas Elliott talking about Donald Trump and his legal problems in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Douglas Elliott. He is a partner with Cambridge LLP. He's a lawyer, a civil litigator, a constitutional law expert, and he's gone through the New York judge's finding on the civil suit of fraud against the Trump organization and Donald Trump with a fine-tooth comb, and has published some comments on it that we're chatting about today. Douglas, I was interested in one of your sections. You talk about this review of all the witnesses and the credibility, and you said it was a very careful analysis, and it goes on for like 53 pages, which is really an incredible amount of dedication. 2/3 of the reasoning is assessing the credibility of the witnesses. Tell me what you read from that reading.
Well, first of all, It's a model of clarity of legal reasoning. I want to tell you, I read legal decisions all the time. Some judges don't write that well. This judge writes very clearly. Even a non-lawyer could understand what he's talking about pretty easily, I think, because he writes that plainly and clearly. He went through every single witness. That's not always the case in these types of decisions, I want you to know. But he went through every single witness, summarized their evidence, and told what the essence of that evidence was, and then said whether he found that witness credible or not credible and why. And he went through first he went through all of the state of New York's witnesses, which included like all of the big players. So the representative of Deutsche Bank, who was his main lender, and all of the lending arrangements and what they would have been if he told the truth, what they actually were based on the lie. And of course, we know that he was fired by Deutsche Bank once they found out that he had lied his face off to them. Then the accountants from Mazars, they testified. There were expert witnesses, one very important expert witness who testified about how much Trump had been enriched by paying the lower interest rate instead of the higher interest rate that he should have been. And that was a president of an investment bank who had been qualified as an expert witness many times. And the judge found his evidence extremely helpful and reliable. Perhaps the most interesting among the state witnesses was Michael Cohen. Of course, everyone knows about Michael Cohen. He was disbarred for his misconduct. He was involved in the porn star payoff scandal that Trump is still facing separate proceedings about. But one thing that really emerges very clearly is that Stormy Daniels, that fake accounting records around Stormy Daniels, that was not an exception for the way the Trump organization cooked the books. That was typical. Michael Cohen was one of four chefs in charge of cooking the books, along with Alan Weisselberg and two others, to manipulate the records of the Trump organization to please Donald Trump and to achieve his financial objectives with lending or getting government contracts from time to time. Trump, of course, that's a tough witness to put forward, Michael Cohen, because he's been convicted of perjury. Yep. And you're putting forward a convicted perjurer as one of your witnesses. And yet, Justice Engoron said, well, I believe that convicted perjurers are capable of telling the truth. I know Michael Cohen is hostile to Donald Trump, but I believe him. I believe him in this case because all of the documents that I've seen and evidence from other witnesses corroborates everything that Michael Cohen has said in my court. I believe his evidence to be true. Michael Cohen told the truth, he said. That is amazing. But I want people to understand, a lot of people got the impression that Michael Cohen was somehow the linchpin of this whole case. The judge makes it very clear in his decision that Michael Cohen was not the linchpin of the case, that in fact, the judge could have come to the same conclusion without Michael Cohen. Okay, so then we come to the Donald Trump witnesses. The Donald Trump witnesses, by and large, a very pathetic group of witnesses. Donald Trump and his two sons were contemptuous, contemptible. They claimed they didn't remember things. They said there was nothing wrong. When confronted, like Donald Trump is a nightmare client for any lawyer. When confronted with the tax fraud conviction for Weisselberg, he said there was nothing wrong with what they had done. He'd do it all over again. And other companies like IBM do exactly the same thing. But the only reason Trump got convicted is because he's Trump and everybody's out to get him, is what he told the judge. You know, that's the kind of...
About a tax fraud. He's suggesting everyone does tax fraud.
Everyone is engaging in tax fraud, and they're just picking on him because he's Donald Trump and he's Republican candidate for president. By the way, the fact that he's the Republican candidate for president plays absolutely no role in the analysis whatsoever. The only time it really even comes up as relevant is the fact that when Trump became the president, he had to give up control over the organization to his two sons, who became trustees of a trust for his assets. So that's described in just a very matter-of-fact way. And it had some legal consequences because they ended up being liable for what happened while they had control. But it's very clear there's not a trace of politics in this decision whatsoever. So they were terrible witnesses. They also called a bunch of his friends who said much the same thing, members of the Mar-a-Lago Club and so on, who said, oh yeah, Mar-a-Lago's worth $1 billion, or that everybody cheats and they're just picking on Donald Trump, that kind of thing. The judge found most of the Donald Trump evidence, and there was a lot of it, was either dishonest or unhelpful. And when a judge makes a finding like that, it's very hard to overturn on appeal. There were only two witnesses that were useful at all or credible at all for Donald Trump. One was one who testified about the losses and tried to argue that the losses were that the bank had suffered by not being able to charge the correct interest rate was more like in the $20 million range as opposed to the $160 million range. But the judge has a very long passage where he carefully picks through that evidence and finds that the expert was not, even though he had more credibility than another accounting expert. By the way, the other accounting expert was paid $1 million and has been criticized by a number of other judges for being a hired gun. But this
also quite a criticism of the two finance Trump senior managers, Jeffrey McConney and Alan Weisenberg, I think, and that they had severance agreements that said they weren't allowed to cooperate with investigations. Seriously?
They had severance agreements that said they weren't allowed to cooperate with investigations into Trump. And at the time they were testifying, they hadn't been paid the full amount they were owed under those severance agreements. And the implication was obvious that if their testimony was unhelpful to Trump, they weren't going to get the end of their money. But Weisselberg really got screwed in this one because Weisselberg, he was supposed to get $2 million under his severance agreement. He obviously tried to help Trump as much as he could with his evidence. But at the end, the judge said, that $1 million you got, Weisselberg, that's proceeds of crime. So you're going to have to give that $1 million over to the state of New York. So he actually got zero for his severance agreement, for perjuring himself and going to jail for tax fraud. He's going to get nothing from Trump.
And described by the lawyer as intentionally evasive?
Intentionally evasive. It's very clear that he perjured himself. He was the chef de cuisine of cooking the books, was Weisselberg. That's very clear. You know, the idea that he made a few little mistakes, like the case of the tax fraud case, absolutely not. This organization, I think you'd have to work really hard to find an honest transaction in the whole history of this organization.
Your final comment was that you thought that he may have even got off lightly. Seriously? Lightly?
Yeah, lightly, because they only looked at a few of these transactions. If you look at it, I think there's an argument to be made that Donald Trump's entire personal wealth has been built on his inheritance from his father and a long series of fraud. I think they should have taken away the license. They should have put the organization into receivership, and he and his sons should have been banned for life from ever doing business in the state of New York. I think if I had been the judge, that's what I would have done.
I did hear a comment that it went from a lifetime ban to 3-year ban and 2-year bans because he didn't want to have it appealed or appealable. Oh
yeah, well he had already. There was an interim order he had made when he first found out from the monitor, the Judge Jones, who had been in there, when he found out all the shenanigans that were going on, right under the nose of the monitor. I mean, I don't know if you've ever dealt with a company that's been in receivership or had a monitor, Brian, but They are the eyes and ears of the court, and you have to behave like a Boy Scout around those people. Instead, Trump and his band of thieves just carried on as if she wasn't even there. And of course, she was giving reports to the court saying, you know, there's a big problem here. Now, the judge, as a result of that, had issued an order canceling the licenses of all of the Trump businesses. And Trump appealed that to an appeal court and said, whoa, 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 you shouldn't be doing this on an interim basis. Wait until I get to trial. I may have a defense. And the appeal court for once agreed with Trump and said, no, let's wait until the case goes to trial. When the case went to trial, the judge said, look, I've read the appeal court decision, and I think there's going to be a lot of adverse economic impact of taking away the business licenses, and I'm not going to do that. My focus is on the bad men. It's on Donald Trump. It's on Alan Weisselberg. It's on Donald Trump Jr. It's on Eric Trump. They're the bad actors. They're the ones that I'm going to penalize in this decision for their decades of dishonest practice.
We're going to take a break and come back with Douglas Elliott in just 2 minutes with some concluding comments to try to put this in the context of everything else that's going on. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Interesting conversation tonight with legal expert Douglas Elliott of Cambridge LLP, a civil litigator, constitutional expert, etc. We've been chatting about this New York State case and the sizable fine. Douglas, I wonder if you can put it in context. 3 weeks. There's the case, the criminal case in New York on the fraud payments coming. The Supreme Court is going to someday soon talk about the immunity case. What's going on in Georgia with this issue about whether there was a conflict of interest? The big case in Washington about January 6th. Put it all in context. What's going to happen now, do you think?
Well, Trump is in big trouble because he has a huge need for cash to pay lawyers for all of these legal cases that he's facing. And he has now had all of his cash wiped out between the Carroll case and this case. And that means he's not going to be able to pay his lawyers. And he stiffs lawyers all the time, but lawyers are going to stop working for him and they're not getting paid. I don't know where he's going to get the money to pay them. I really don't. He's going to have to start selling assets like Mar-a-Lago, which will break his heart and humiliate him. Or he's going to have to borrow from shady lenders like Russian banks, which are going to be, that's going to be very well known. That's going to hurt his chances. He's also going to not be able to use money to buy advertising and do all the normal things that candidates do. And he's going to be distracted. I'm hoping this is going to cost him the presidency. It should. He's a crook. He has no business being in the White House. But what we have seen in these cases, in the surveys that have been done, if you want to keep, Trump has a popular cult. You want to keep him out of the White House, you have to convict him of something, and you have to cut off the cash. Well, I think the cash has now been cut off. And I think because of that, he's going to have trouble defending himself. He won't be able to pay his lawyers. And also, the next judge, this judge said it's not his first rodeo. The next judge, the Stormy Daniels case, is going to say, look, it's already been established that you cook the books relentlessly and that you and Cohen have conspired with Weisselberg to engage in fraud. Why would I come to a different conclusion in the Stormy Daniels case? I think he's going to get convicted. And surveys have shown that even though 75% of Republicans will agree to put a convicted Donald Trump in the White House, which is a disgrace to that formerly great party. But 25% of Republicans have said, I draw the line if Donald Trump gets convicted. I'm hoping he gets convicted. That keeps him out of the White House. And his whole strategy on these cases has been to get elected and use the power of the presidency to get himself out of trouble and punish his enemies.
And he can maybe give himself a pardon for federal cases, but can't for criminal cases or New York cases or Georgia cases. This immunity case that is being decided right now by the Supreme Court, how do you think it's going to find, and why is it taking so long?
It takes so long because Donald Trump appeals everything. He knows the legal system extremely well, and he's a master at manipulating it and creating delay. And uh, everyone has to work hard to try and, Jack Smith has been working really hard to try and keep things going. Uh, Donald Trump, he is really upset that the people he appointed to the Supreme Court won't do his bidding. I don't think they're going to do his bidding on the immunity case. I think he's going to win the other case, the 14th Amendment case, or the reactions from the judges around the argument. That case is much less clear because that section has never been argued. So I think there's a possibility that the Supreme Court will say, we can't let states decide whether someone engaged in insurrection. We have to wait for Congress to create a process to enforce this section. And until they do that, we have to leave it alone. I think that's what's going to happen there. But on the immunity case, I think the courts are going to say no one is above the law. The idea that just because you were once the president of the United States means you can defraud people. You can, as he said to the Court of Appeal, he said as president, he was entitled to direct Navy SEALs to assassinate his political opponents, and he could not be prosecuted criminally for that unless he had first been impeached and convicted. And now that is an extraordinary proposition. And I don't even think people like Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas are going to go for that. He's going to lose that one. So that means he's open to being convicted. And the question is just, can the criminal process go quickly enough to convict him before November?
Douglas Elliott, thank you so much for your very thoughtful and intensive and rigorous review of this New York State case. It was really quite interesting to me. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from Elliott Lake. And you can get all my podcasts and videos on my website, briancrombie.com, as well as on all social media and on YouTube. Thanks. Good night.
Good night.